What would you do if the person you grieved for 8 years walked into a diner holding your stepfather's hand? What if everything you believed about love, death, and family turned out to be a carefully crafted lie? This isn't fiction. This is the story of Daniel Whitmore, a man who buried his wife twice, once in his heart and once in the ground, or so he thought. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that their death felt like losing a piece of your soul? Have you ever rebuilt your entire life around grief, only to discover that grief was built on deception? Daniel thought he knew what betrayal looked like until that quiet Sunday morning in Boone Hollow, Kentucky, when his dead wife walked back into his life. But she wasn't walking back to him. She was walking toward the man who had become his father figure. The human mind struggles with impossible scenarios. When we see something that contradicts our deepest beliefs about reality, our brain fights to make sense of it. Daniel's brain couldn't process what his eyes were showing him, because according to every official document, every tearful phone call, every sleepless night for the past 8 years, Asha Verma Whitmore had died in a car crash in rural India. Her body had been too damaged to view. Her family had rushed the funeral. Daniel had returned to America with nothing but memories and a death certificate. But now she was laughing. Now she was alive. Now she was in love with someone else. Someone Daniel called family. Do you know what it feels like when your entire reality crumbles in a single moment? When everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you reveals itself as an elaborate performance. Most of us will never experience this level of psychological devastation. But Daniel Whitmore lived through it twice. First when he thought Asha died. Then when he realized she never died at all. Here's what makes this case particularly disturbing. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. This wasn't a woman who looked similar to his deceased wife. DNA doesn't lie. Scars don't lie. The tiny birthmark on her left wrist that Daniel had kissed 1,000 times doesn't lie. This was Asha, his Asha, very much alive and very much in love with his stepfather. Before we go any further, I need to address something. If you're watching this video and you haven't subscribed yet, you're missing out on stories that mainstream media won't touch. Stories like this one, where truth is stranger than any fiction Hollywood could create. The cases I cover require extensive research, international investigation, and interviews with people who often don't want to talk. Without subscribers supporting this channel, these stories remain buried. So if you value truth over comfort, if you want access to cases that will challenge everything you think you know about human nature, hit that subscribe button now. Because what I'm about to tell you about Daniel, Asha, and Robert will make you question every relationship in your life. The question that haunted Daniel wasn't just how Asha was alive. It was why she had chosen to stay dead to him while building a new life with his stepfather. Was this always the plan? Had Robert been orchestrating this from the beginning? Or was Asha a victim who had become entangled in something beyond her control? Think about the people you trust most in your life. Your spouse, your parents, your step-parents. Now think about this. What if they were all working together to deceive you? What if the person you married had been planning their exit from the moment they said, "I do"? What if the man who stepped into your life as a father figure had ulterior motives that went beyond family? This case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. About how far people will go to protect themselves. About how elaborate deception can become when desperation meets opportunity. About how the people we trust most are often the ones best positioned to destroy us. Daniel Whitmore thought he was living a love story. Then he thought he was living a tragedy. But what he was actually living was a psychological thriller where he was the only one who didn't know the plot. And when the truth finally revealed itself, it came in the worst possible way. Not through a phone call or a letter or a confession, but through seeing his supposedly dead wife holding hands with his stepfather in a small-town diner on a random Sunday morning. The emotional whiplash alone could have killed him. But Daniel survived. And what he discovered next about the night Asha died will make you realize that some betrayals are so complex, so carefully planned, that they take years to fully understand. Are you ready to learn how a simple love story became an international conspiracy? Are you prepared to discover what happens when grief becomes the foundation for an even deeper deception? Daniel Whitmore was the kind of man who fixed things for a living and expected life to follow logical patterns. Born in Marion, Ohio, to parents who believed in hard work and quiet dignity, he grew up assuming that effort equaled results. His father sold insurance policies to farmers and factory workers. His mother administered vaccines and took blood pressure readings at the county clinic. Their son would become an engineer because engineers solved problems with measurable solutions. By his early 30s, Daniel had built a respectable career designing infrastructure projects across developing nations. His specialty was water treatment facilities, systems that could transform contaminated sources into clean, drinkable water for entire communities. The work required extended contracts in places most Americans couldn't locate on a map. But Daniel thrived in challenging environments. He spoke enough Spanish to navigate South America, had picked up basic Arabic during projects in North Africa, and possessed the cultural sensitivity that made him valuable to international firms. His colleagues described him as methodical, reliable, and slightly boring. Daniel preferred structure over chaos, planning over spontaneity. He read technical manuals for entertainment and collected vintage engineering textbooks. At company parties, he was the guy who left early and always designated a driver. His longest relationship had lasted 14 months and ended when his girlfriend complained that dating Daniel felt like scheduling appointments with a very polite robot. Everything changed when Bharat Infrastructure Solutions offered him an 18-month contract in Bangalore. The project involved modernizing water systems across Karnataka state, exactly the kind of large-scale challenge Daniel had spent his career preparing for. He arrived in India expecting heat, bureaucracy, and the familiar rhythm of technical problem-solving. He found all of that, but he also found Asha Verma. Their first meeting occurred during a contract negotiation that had stalled over environmental impact assessments. Daniel represented the engineering firm. Asha represented the government regulatory committee. She was 31, sharp-featured, with dark hair typically braided down her back and eyes that missed nothing during presentations. While other committee members asked predictable questions about timelines and budgets, Asha focused on long-term sustainability and community impact. "Your proposal addresses water purification," she said during their third meeting, her English accent carrying traces of both British colonial education and regional Indian inflections. "But what happens to the waste byproducts? Where do the chemical residues go when your 18-month contract ends and your team flies back to America?" Daniel had prepared for technical challenges. He hadn't prepared for someone who questioned the ethical implications of his work. Most clients wanted fast, cheap, effective solutions. Asha wanted solutions that wouldn't create new problems for future generations. Their professional discussions evolved into longer conversations over tea. Those conversations evolved into dinners that stretched past midnight. The relationship developed quickly despite obvious complications. Daniel was a temporary resident with a job that would eventually require him to leave. Asha was deeply connected to her family, her career, and her community. But their intellectual compatibility was undeniable. She challenged his assumptions about sustainable development. He admired her ability to balance idealism with pragmatism. 6 months into the project, Daniel made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He extended his contract for another year and asked Asha to marry him. The proposal wasn't romantic in any traditional sense. They were reviewing water quality reports in his apartment when Daniel looked up from the data sheets and said, "I think we should get married before I have to leave India. I think you should come to America with me. I think we could build something permanent together." Asha stared at him for 30 seconds without speaking. Then she laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine delight at his characteristically practical approach to declaring love. "Daniel Whitmore," she said. "That was possibly the least poetic marriage proposal in human history, yes." The wedding ceremony reflected their different worlds colliding. Asha's family insisted on traditional Hindu rituals that Daniel couldn't pronounce but participated in with earnest respect. His family flew in from Ohio looking overwhelmed by the colors, sounds, and complexity of Indian wedding celebrations. The photographs showed Daniel in traditional Indian formal wear looking simultaneously confused and happy, while Asha appears radiant in red silk, surrounded by relatives who clearly weren't sure what to make of her American husband. Their early married life in Kentucky presented challenges neither had fully anticipated. Asha struggled with small-town American social dynamics. She was overqualified for most available jobs and underqualified for positions that required specific American credentials. The cultural isolation was profound. In Bangalore, she had been a respected professional with a wide social network. In Boone Hollow, she was Daniel's foreign wife, whom people spoke to slowly and loudly, assuming she didn't understand English. Daniel traveled frequently for work, leaving Asha alone for weeks at a time in a place where she felt like an outsider. When he was home, he tried to compensate by being overly attentive, which made Asha feel like a project he was trying to fix rather than a partner he was building a life with. Money became a source of tension. Cultural differences became magnified under stress. Friends noticed that Daniel and Asha's conversations often sounded more like negotiations than natural exchanges between spouses. They loved each other, but love wasn't always enough to bridge the gap between their expectations and their reality. But what Daniel didn't know was that his wife's struggles in Kentucky were about to be overshadowed by problems from her past that she had never told him about. Problems that would soon require her to make a choice between protecting him and protecting herself. Problems that would lead to a phone call from India that would destroy Daniel's world. And problems that would eventually bring his wife face to face with a man Daniel trusted as family. The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November 2015. Daniel was reviewing project specifications for a water treatment facility in Guatemala when his phone rang with an international number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end spoke broken English with an Indian accent he couldn't place. "Mr. Whitmore? This is Inspector Rajesh Kumar, Madhya Pradesh Police. I'm calling about your wife, Mrs. Asha Verma Whitmore. There has been an accident." The words hit Daniel like physical blows. "Accident? Your wife?" The inspector's voice sounded distant, mechanical, as if he was reading from a script. Asha had been traveling with her cousin's family to visit relatives in a rural district outside Bhopal. Their car had gone off the road during heavy monsoon rains. The vehicle had rolled down a steep embankment and caught fire. "Where is she now?" Daniel asked, his engineering mind immediately jumping to logistics. Which hospital? What were her injuries? How quickly could he get there? The silence on the other end lasted too long. "Sir, I am very sorry. The accident was very severe. The fire was very bad. Mrs. Whitmore did not survive." Daniel's legs gave out. He sat down hard on his kitchen floor, still holding the phone, trying to process information that his brain rejected. Asha was supposed to call him when she arrived at her aunt's house. That call was expected yesterday. Now this stranger was telling him she was dead. "I need to speak to her family," Daniel said. "I need to speak to someone who was there." "The family is arranging funeral preparations," Inspector Kumar replied. "They are asking that you come quickly. In our culture, in this heat, burial must happen soon." Daniel was on a plane to India 16 hours later, carrying nothing but a hastily packed bag and documents proving his marriage to Asha. The flight from Louisville to Delhi, with connections in Chicago and Frankfurt, took 26 hours. By the time he reached Bhopal, Asha had been dead for 3 days. Her cousin Priya met him at the airport. Daniel had met Priya twice before, once at their wedding, once during a family visit to Kentucky. She was normally talkative, energetic, quick to laugh. Now she looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying. "Daniel, bye," she said, using the Hindi term for brother-in-law. "I am so sorry that we tried everything. The doctors tried everything." The ride to the family compound took 2 hours through traffic that Daniel normally would have found fascinating. Now he stared out the window seeing nothing, absorbing details about the accident that made no sense. Why had Asha been traveling during the worst storms of the season? Why hadn't anyone called him immediately after the crash? Why did it take 3 days for the police to contact him? Asha's father, Rajesh Verma, greeted Daniel with the kind of formal sympathy reserved for state occasions. They had met several times before and had always gotten along well. But now Rajesh seemed distant, almost uncomfortable. "Beta," he said, using the Hindi word for son. "Asha spoke of you every day. She loved you very much. This tragedy, we must accept God's will." The funeral preparations were already complete. Asha's body lay in a closed wooden casket in the family's courtyard, surrounded by marigold flowers and burning incense. Daniel asked to see her. "It is not advisable," Asha's mother said quietly. "The fire damage was very extensive. Better to remember her as she was. "I need to see my wife," Daniel insisted. The family exchanged glances. Priya spoke up. "Daniel Bai, please trust us. Some things are better left alone. Asha would not want you to see her this way." Every instinct Daniel possessed as an engineer screamed that something was wrong. Engineers verify information. They inspect systems. They don't accept conclusions without examining evidence. But grief has its own logic. Cultural pressure has its own authority. And Daniel was alone in a place where he didn't speak the language, surrounded by people who knew Asha better than he ever had. "Hey, before I continue with what Daniel discovered at the funeral, I need to check something with you. Are you still watching this video? If you're still here, drop the word betrayed in the comments right now. Also, let me know where you're watching from, whether you're in the United States, Canada, the UK, India, or anywhere else in the world. I want to see how far this story is reaching. Because what I'm about to tell you about the evidence Daniel missed will make you understand why this case haunts investigators around the globe. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you're missing stories like this that mainstream media won't cover. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because these cases get more shocking as we dig deeper. The funeral ceremony followed Hindu traditions that Daniel participated in but didn't fully understand. He lit the ceremonial fire. He carried flowers. He accepted condolences from relatives whose names he couldn't remember and whose faces blurred together in his grief. The cremation happened quickly. Too quickly, Daniel would later realize. The entire process felt rushed, as if everyone was eager to complete the rituals and move on. When Daniel asked about the police report, he was told the paperwork would take several weeks to process. When he asked to speak to witnesses from the accident scene, he was told the area was too remote and the witnesses were unavailable. 3 days after arriving in India, Daniel was handed a folder containing Asha's death certificate, medical examiner's report, and police incident documentation. The papers looked official enough, but they were handwritten rather than typed. The signatures were illegible. The medical examiner's seal appeared to have been stamped with inconsistent pressure, leaving parts of the impression unclear. But Daniel was drowning in grief. He wasn't thinking like an engineer. He was thinking like a husband who had lost the person he loved most in the world. The flight back to Kentucky was endless. Daniel sat in his economy seat clutching the folder of documents, trying to make sense of a reality that felt fundamentally altered. Other passengers watched movies, read books, slept. Daniel stared at the seat back in front of him and tried to process the fact that he would never see Asha again. He returned to Boone Hollow alone, to a house that still smelled like the sandalwood incense Asha burned during her evening prayers. Her clothes still hung in their closet. Her books were still stacked beside their bed. Her coffee cup was still in the sink from the morning she had left for India. Daniel's mother, Patricia, had remarried 6 months earlier to a man named Robert Nolan. Robert was 15 years younger than Patricia, charming in a way that made people comfortable quickly. He had moved to Kentucky from somewhere in the South. His accent suggested Tennessee or Alabama, though he was vague about specifics. During the weeks following Daniel's return from India, Robert made himself useful. He handled practical matters that Daniel couldn't face. He organized food deliveries from neighbors. He dealt with phone calls from Daniel's employer. He even helped Daniel sort through Asha's belongings when Daniel finally found the strength to begin that process. "Take your time, son," Robert said, his voice carrying genuine warmth. "Grief doesn't follow schedules. Asha was a special woman. Anyone could see how much she meant to you." Robert's kindness felt like a lifeline during Daniel's darkest period. Here was a man who had no obligation to help but stepped up anyway. A man who called Daniel son with sincerity. A man who seemed to understand that some losses require years to process rather than months. What Daniel didn't know was that Robert Nolan had been making international phone calls during the weeks leading up to Asha's supposed death. Phone calls to numbers in India that would later prove impossible to trace. Phone calls that lasted hours but generated no billing records. Phone calls that suggested Robert's involvement in Daniel's tragedy went deeper than simple stepfather sympathy. The red flags were there. But grief makes people miss details that would normally trigger suspicion. And Robert was very good at appearing helpful while keeping his true motives hidden. Daniel Whitmore became a ghost of himself after returning from India. Friends described the transformation as watching someone slowly disappear while still occupying the same physical space. The man who had once attacked engineering problems with methodical precision now struggled to complete basic tasks. He would start projects and abandon them halfway through. He accepted work contracts and then called in sick for days at a time. His colleagues learned to give him assignments that wouldn't collapse if he suddenly became unreachable. The house in Boone Hollow became a shrine to suspended time. Asha's reading glasses remained on the kitchen counter where she had left them. Her half-finished crossword puzzles stayed folded beside the sofa. Daniel couldn't bring himself to throw away expired spices from her collection, even when they lost their scent and turned to powder. Visitors found the preservation disturbing, but Daniel found it necessary. Moving Asha's belongings felt like killing her a second time. Sleep became Daniel's enemy. During the day, he could distract himself with work or television or mechanical tasks around the house. But nighttime brought dreams where Asha was still alive, still laughing, still arguing with him about sustainable development projects over dinner. He would wake up reaching for her side of the bed, only to find cold sheets and the crushing realization that she wasn't coming back. Robert Nolan filled the void that Daniel's grief had created. While Daniel withdrew from social connections, Robert stepped forward as a stabilizing presence. He showed up for family dinners when Daniel couldn't manage conversation. He handled phone calls from Daniel's employer when depression made communication impossible. He even helped Daniel maintain the house when basic upkeep became overwhelming. Grief is a process, not an event, Robert would say, his southern accent lending warmth to words that felt like professional therapy. Asha wouldn't want you to stop living because she couldn't keep living. Robert's background remained mysteriously vague, but his helpfulness was undeniable. He claimed to have worked in business consulting before marrying Patricia, though he never specified what kind of consulting or for which companies. He had enough money to avoid working regular hours, which meant he was available whenever Daniel needed assistance. He spoke about travel extensively but was evasive about specific destinations. He knew enough about international affairs to hold conversations about Daniel's overseas projects, but deflected questions about how he had acquired such knowledge. The relationship between Daniel and Robert developed slowly. Robert never pushed for intimacy or tried to replace Daniel's deceased father. Instead, he positioned himself as a reliable friend who happened to be married to Daniel's mother. When Daniel's work required him to travel, Robert checked on the house. When Daniel needed someone to talk through technical problems, Robert listened without pretending to understand engineering concepts. When Daniel struggled with anniversary dates or holidays, Robert was quietly present without making demands on his time or attention. Years passed. Daniel's acute grief softened into chronic loneliness, but he began functioning again. He accepted longer international contracts because traveling felt easier than staying home. He sold the house where he and Asha had lived together and moved into a smaller apartment that held no memories. He dated occasionally, though relationships never progressed beyond casual dinners and polite conversation. Women sensed that Daniel was emotionally unavailable in ways that had nothing to do with commitment issues and everything to do with unprocessed trauma. Robert remained a constant throughout these changes. He helped Daniel move apartments. He provided references for job applications. He remembered Asha's birthday and the anniversary of her death without making Daniel feel obligated to acknowledge those dates. He was present without being intrusive, supportive without being controlling. By 2020, 5 years after Asha's death, Daniel had constructed a manageable life around his loss. He worked on infrastructure projects in Central America and Southeast Asia. He maintained cordial relationships with neighbors and colleagues. He visited his mother and Robert for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. He had accepted that happiness might not be possible again, but survival was achievable. Robert, meanwhile, had become an integral part of the Whitmore family ecosystem. Patricia clearly adored her younger husband. Daniel's extended relatives appreciated Robert's willingness to help with family obligations. Even Daniel's old friends had grown accustomed to Robert's presence at social gatherings. He was charming without being overwhelming, helpful without being intrusive, knowledgeable without being arrogant. What nobody recognized was that Robert's 5-year presence in their lives had been strategic rather than organic. His helpfulness wasn't kindness, it was investment. His emotional support wasn't empathy, it was manipulation. His interest in Daniel's well-being wasn't familial concern, it was guilty conscience management. Because while Daniel spent 8 years rebuilding his identity around loss, Robert spent those same 8 years orchestrating the most complex deception of his life. A deception that required international coordination, financial resources, and the kind of long-term planning that suggests criminal sophistication rather than opportunistic fraud. Sunday, October 15, 2023, started like every other Sunday for the past 8 years. Daniel woke up alone, made coffee for one person, and drove to Murphy's Diner for breakfast before visiting his mother. He had no reason to expect anything unusual. The weather was mild for October in Kentucky. The diner was busy with the typical weekend crowd of families and elderly couples. Daniel ordered his usual scrambled eggs, wheat toast, black coffee, and settled into a corner booth with his phone and a technical manual he was reviewing for work. He was reading about water filtration systems when movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A couple had entered the diner and was being seated across the room. The woman walked with a particular gait that triggered a memory Daniel couldn't quite access. Something about the way she held her shoulders, the length of her stride, the slight turn of her head as she scanned the room. Daniel looked up from his manual. The woman's face was turned away from him, but her profile was unmistakable. The curve of her cheek, the way her dark hair fell across her shoulder, the small silver earrings she always wore. It was Asha, his wife, who had been dead for 8 years, holding hands with Robert Nolan. Daniel's coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered against the linoleum floor. Hot liquid splashed across his jeans, but he didn't feel the burn. He didn't hear the ceramic breaking or the concerned voices of other diners asking if he was okay. Every sense in his body had focused on the impossible sight across the restaurant. Asha was laughing at something Robert had said. Not someone who looked like Asha. Not a woman with similar features or comparable height or matching hair color. This was his wife. The scar on her left hand from where she had cut herself cooking during their second week of marriage. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. The small birthmark just below her collarbone that Daniel had kissed countless times. She was wearing clothes he had never seen before. A blue sweater that complemented her skin tone and jeans that fit her perfectly. She looked healthy. She looked happy. She looked like a woman who had been living a comfortable life for the past 8 years while her husband grieved her death. Robert reached across the table and took her hand. Asha smiled and intertwined their fingers. The gesture was intimate, familiar, natural. These were not two people who had recently met or were tentatively exploring attraction. These were two people who had been together long enough to develop unconscious patterns of affection. Daniel's brain refused to process what his eyes were showing him. This violated every law of physics, biology, and reality that he understood. Dead people don't order pancakes at small-town diners. Dead people don't hold hands with their husband's stepfather. Dead people don't laugh at jokes while their widowed spouse sits 50 feet away having a psychological breakdown. The rational part of Daniel's mind generated explanations that couldn't possibly be true. Maybe this was a hallucination brought on by stress or lack of sleep. Maybe this was a vivid dream that would end when he woke up. Maybe this was some kind of elaborate prank or social experiment. Maybe he was having a nervous breakdown and none of this was real. But the birthmark was real. The scar was real. The way she tilted her head when Robert spoke was exactly the way she had tilted her head when Daniel spoke during their marriage. A waitress approached Daniel's table with towels to clean up the spilled coffee. "Honey, are you all right?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Daniel couldn't respond. He was seeing a ghost. A ghost who was very much alive and very much in love with someone else. He watched Asha and Robert order food. He watched them share an appetizer, feeding each other bites with the casual intimacy of an established couple. He watched Asha reach into her purse, a purse Daniel had never seen before, and pull out reading glasses to examine the menu. New glasses, which meant she had been alive long enough to need an eye exam. Long enough for her prescription to change. Long enough to develop new habits and preferences and relationships. How long had she been alive? How long had she been with Robert? Had she been alive the entire time Daniel thought she was dead? Had their marriage been real, or had she been planning her exit from the beginning? Had Robert been involved in her disappearance from the start, or had he found her later? The questions multiplied faster than Daniel could process them. Each possible answer led to more disturbing implications. If Asha had faked her death, who else was involved? If Robert had helped her, what did he gain from the deception? If they had been together for years, how many times had Robert sat at Daniel's kitchen table offering comfort while secretly living with Daniel's supposedly dead wife? Daniel needed to leave the diner before they saw him. He needed to think. He needed to plan his next move carefully. But his legs wouldn't cooperate. His body had entered some kind of shock state where movement felt impossible and breathing required conscious effort. That's when Asha looked directly at him. Their eyes met across the crowded restaurant. Recognition flashed across her face. Surprise, fear, panic, and something else Daniel couldn't identify. She went completely still. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Her face drained of color. Robert noticed her reaction and turned to see what had captured her attention. When he spotted Daniel, his expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like resignation. Not surprise, not shock, resignation, as if he had been expecting this moment and dreading its arrival. The three of them stared at each other across Murphy's diner while conversations continued around them, while other customers ate their meals and discussed their weekend plans. While life proceeded normally for everyone except the three people trapped in this impossible triangle. Asha whispered something to Robert that Daniel couldn't hear. Robert nodded and stood up. He walked slowly across the restaurant toward Daniel's table, his hands raised slightly, as if approaching a dangerous animal. "Daniel," Robert said quietly, "we need to talk." "She's dead," Daniel replied, his voice barely audible. "I went to her funeral, that I have her death certificate, that I scattered her ashes." "I know," Robert said. "This isn't how we wanted you to find out." Robert had said we, as if he and Asha were a team, as if they had been planning together, as if Daniel was the outsider in this situation rather than the grieving husband who had been living a lie for 8 years. What would you do in this moment? What would you do if you discovered that your dead spouse was alive and in a relationship with your stepfather? Would you scream? Would you call the police? Would you demand explanations? Would you run away? Comment below and let me know what you would do, because Daniel's next decision would determine whether he got answers or whether this secret stayed buried forever. Daniel stood up slowly, his legs shaking but functional. He needed to get out of the diner before he collapsed completely. He needed to process this information somewhere private. He needed to figure out how many people had been lying to him and for how long. "My house," Daniel said to Robert. "1 hour. Both of you. If you're not there, I'm calling the police and telling them I just saw my dead wife having lunch with my stepfather." Robert nodded. "We'll be there." Daniel walked out of Murphy's diner and climbed into his truck. He sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel and trying to remember how to breathe. Then he drove home to wait for the two people who had destroyed his life twice. Once when they made him think Asha was dead, and once when they let him discover she was alive. Daniel's house felt different when he walked through the front door, knowing that his dead wife would soon be sitting in his living room. The familiar spaces looked foreign, as if the revelation at the diner had altered the fundamental properties of reality. He moved through rooms he had occupied for 3 years, touching surfaces that suddenly felt like props in an elaborate stage production he hadn't known he was performing in. He made coffee with shaking hands, then poured it down the sink because the idea of consuming anything felt impossible. He checked his appearance in the bathroom mirror and found a stranger looking back. A man who had aged 8 years in 8 hours. He tried to practice what he would say when they arrived, but every sentence sounded insane when spoken aloud. The doorbell rang at exactly 4:17 p.m. Daniel opened the door to find Robert and Asha standing on his porch like invited guests rather than co-conspirators in the most devastating deception of his adult life. Asha had changed clothes. She now wore a black dress that Daniel recognized from their marriage, one he had helped her choose for a company dinner in Bangalore 7 years ago. The sight of that familiar dress on her living body hit him like a physical blow. "Hello, Daniel," Asha said, her voice carrying the same slight accent he remembered but lacking any of the warmth it had once held for him. They entered his living room and sat on his couch as if this was a normal social visit. Robert chose the chair closest to the door, positioning himself between Asha and any potential exit. Daniel remained standing, too agitated to sit, too confused to think clearly. "Start talking," Daniel said. "Start explaining how my dead wife is sitting in my living room wearing a dress I bought her when she was supposed to be cremated 8 years ago." Asha looked at Robert, who nodded encouragingly. The exchange confirmed what Daniel had suspected. They had rehearsed this conversation. They had anticipated this moment and prepared their story. "Daniel," Asha began, her hands folded in her lap like a penitent child, "I know this is shocking, I know you have questions. But you have to understand that what happened wasn't my choice, it was survival." "Survival?" Daniel's voice cracked. "You survived by making me think you were dead. You survived by letting me grieve for 8 years while you were alive and apparently living with my stepfather." "It's more complicated than that," Robert interjected. "Asha was in danger. Real danger. From people who would have hurt her and potentially you if they had found her." "What people?" Daniel demanded. "What danger? And why didn't anyone tell me about any of this?" Asha's composure began to crack. Tears formed in her eyes, but Daniel couldn't tell if they were genuine or performative. "My family had debts," she said. "Serious debts to serious people. My brother had borrowed money from men who don't accept late payments or payment plans. When he couldn't repay what he owed, they came looking for leverage. What does that have to do with faking your death? They threatened to kidnap me," Asha continued, "to hold me until my family paid what my brother owed. But my family didn't have that kind of money. The only way to protect everyone was to disappear completely. If I was dead, I couldn't be used as collateral." The story sounded plausible, but details didn't align with Daniel's memories. "Your family never mentioned any of this when I was in India for the funeral. Your father seemed genuinely grief-stricken. Your cousins were devastated. Were they all acting?" "Some of them knew," Asha admitted, "but not everyone. The fewer people who knew I was alive, the safer it was for everyone involved." "Including me?" Asha and Robert exchanged another look. "Daniel," Robert said carefully, "if you had known Asha was alive, would you have been able to act normally around your family and friends? Would you have been able to keep the secret? Or would you have done something that put her in danger?" The implication was clear. They had protected Daniel by lying to him. They had manipulated him for his own good. They had made him suffer through years of grief because they didn't trust him to handle the truth responsibly. "So where have you been living for 8 years?" Daniel asked Asha. "If you've been hiding from dangerous people, how did you end up in Kentucky holding hands with my stepfather?" This was where their rehearsed story began to fall apart. Asha looked at Robert again, but this time he didn't provide guidance. "I moved around for the first few years," she said slowly. "Different cities in India. Different names. Different jobs. It was lonely and frightening, but it was necessary. And then, Robert found me," she said, the words sounding uncomfortable in her mouth. "Robert found you?" Daniel turned to face his stepfather. "How did you even know to look for her? How did you know she was alive when I thought she was dead?" Robert shifted in his chair. "I had suspicions about the accident report," he said. "Some of the details didn't make sense. The timing seemed convenient. I started making inquiries through private investigators." "What kind of inquiries? And why would you hire private investigators to look into my wife's death without telling me?" "Because if I was wrong, I didn't want to give you false hope. And if I was right, I needed to understand the situation before involving you." Daniel's engineering mind began analyzing the logistics. "When did you first suspect something was wrong?" "About 6 months after the funeral," Robert replied. "And when did you find her?" 3 years ago." 3 years ago? Daniel's voice rose. "You've known my wife was alive for 3 years and you didn't tell me?" "It wasn't that simple," Robert said. "When I found Asha, she was still in danger. The people who wanted to hurt her were still looking. Bringing her back to America required careful planning and significant resources." "What kind of resources?" Robert hesitated. "Legal documentation, safe transportation, financial support." "You're talking about illegal documentation," Daniel said. You're talking about human trafficking. I'm talking about saving your wife's life, Robert replied. But Daniel was starting to see holes in their explanation that suggested a different narrative entirely. If Asha was in hiding for her own protection, why is she now living openly in Kentucky? If these dangerous people were still looking for her 3 years ago, what changed? Neither Asha nor Robert had immediate answers. And another thing, Daniel continued, his anger building momentum. If you've been secretly married to my supposedly dead wife for 3 years, where does that leave your marriage to my mother? Are you committing bigamy? Is my mother an unwitting accomplice to whatever this is? Patricia doesn't know, Robert said quietly. Patricia doesn't know what? That you're married to someone else? That my dead wife is alive? That you've been lying to our entire family for years? The room fell silent. Daniel looked at Asha and Robert sitting on his couch like defendants awaiting sentencing. Everything about their body language suggested guilt rather than relief at finally telling the truth. There's something else, Daniel said slowly. Something you're not telling me. Because none of this explains why you two are together romantically. None of this explains why my wife is holding your hand instead of trying to contact me. None of this explains why she looks happy rather than traumatized. Asha began crying, but her tears looked more like frustration than sadness. Daniel, she said, I know this is hard to understand, but 8 years is a long time. People change. Circumstances change. What we had together was beautiful, but it was also complicated. When Robert found me, I was broken. He helped me rebuild my life. He protected me. He gave me stability. And you fell in love with him. Yes. The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Daniel felt something fundamental break inside his chest. Not his heart, which had been broken 8 years ago, but his ability to trust his own perceptions about reality. How long? He asked. How long have you two been together? Does it matter? Robert replied. It matters to me. Asha wiped her eyes. 5 years. 5 years. Which meant their relationship had begun shortly after Robert found her. Which meant Robert had been comforting Daniel about his grief while simultaneously sleeping with Daniel's wife. Which meant every family dinner, every holiday celebration, every moment of support Robert had provided had been contaminated by this betrayal. But Daniel was beginning to suspect that even this confession was incomplete, because the timeline still didn't make sense, because Robert's explanations raised more questions than they answered, and because the look that passed between them suggested they were still hiding the most damaging truth of all. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He couldn't eat. He couldn't process the conversation that had destroyed every assumption he had built his adult life around. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad and began writing down everything he could remember about Asha's death, Robert's timeline, and the inconsistencies that were now glaringly obvious in hindsight. The first anomaly was Robert's knowledge of international procedures. How does a man who claims to have worked in business consulting know enough about Indian bureaucracy to identify fraudulent death certificates? How does someone with a vague Southern background develop contacts with private investigators who can track missing persons across continents? Robert had resources and connections that didn't match his modest lifestyle or his marriage to Patricia. Daniel drove to the Boone County Library the next morning and spent 6 hours researching everything he could find about Robert Nolan. Marriage records showed Robert had married Patricia in 2014, but there were no employment records, no credit history, and no educational background prior to his arrival in Kentucky. It was as if Robert had materialized in their lives fully formed with no traceable past. The more Daniel investigated, the more questions multiplied. He contacted the private investigator Robert claimed to have hired, but the phone number led to a disconnected line. He tried to verify Robert's story about discovering inconsistencies in the Indian police report, but the original documents had conveniently disappeared from Daniel's filing system. He attempted to reach Inspector Rajesh Kumar, who had called him about Asha's accident, but Indian authorities had no record of an officer by that name working in Madhya Pradesh in 2015. Every thread Daniel pulled led to more evidence that the entire story had been fabricated from the beginning. He hired his own private investigator, a former police detective named Marcus Chen who specialized in international fraud cases. Chen's initial findings were disturbing. The phone number that had called Daniel about Asha's death traced to a prepaid cellular account purchased in Mumbai with cash. The death certificate Daniel had received contained security features that didn't match official Indian government documents from that time period. Most significantly, there was no record of a car accident on the highway where Asha supposedly died on the date listed in the police report. Mr. Whitmore, Chun told Daniel during their second meeting, "I've seen elaborate insurance fraud schemes. I've investigated fake death scams for witness protection purposes. But this case has elements that suggest something more complex. The level of planning and international coordination required to pull this off indicates professional criminal involvement." Daniel asked the question that had been haunting him for weeks. "Do you think Robert was involved from the beginning?" "I think Robert Nolan isn't Robert Nolan," Chun replied. "The identity appears to be constructed. Real name, real person, but someone who died in Alabama in 1987 at age 16. Someone took that identity and built a life around it." The implications were staggering. Robert hadn't just helped Asha fake her death. He had been operating under a false identity the entire time he was married to Daniel's mother, which meant Patricia was married to someone whose real name she didn't know, which meant their entire family had been infiltrated by a professional con artist who had played a role for nearly a decade. But why? What did Robert gain from this elaborate deception? What was the ultimate objective? Daniel's obsession with finding answers began affecting his work, his health, and his relationships. He lost 15 pounds in 2 months. He called in sick to engineering projects and spent the time researching international fraud networks. He interrogated Patricia about Robert's background until she became defensive and accused Daniel of having a psychological breakdown. "Listen, I know this story is getting intense and I need to address something important. If you're watching this video and you're not subscribed to this channel, you're missing the kind of investigative work that mainstream media won't do. Cases like Daniel's require months of research, international contacts, and interviews with people who often don't want to talk. These stories don't get told without channels like mine that are willing to dig deeper than surface-level reporting. So if you value truth over comfort, if you want access to cases that challenge everything you think you know about human nature and deception, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Because what I'm about to reveal about Robert's real identity will make you question everyone you trust. And remember, the only way these investigations continue is with your support. The forensic inconsistencies in Asha's case file multiplied as Daniel dug deeper. The medical examiner's signature on her death certificate didn't match signatures on other documents supposedly signed by the same doctor. The crematorium where Asha's body was allegedly burned had no record of a ceremony on the date listed in their paperwork. Most disturbing, the hospital that supposedly treated Asha after the accident had been closed for renovation during the entire month when she supposedly died there. Chen's investigation revealed that Robert had been making regular money transfers to accounts in India for at least 3 years before Asha's supposed death. The amounts were significant, tens of thousands of dollars moving through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The timing suggested Robert had been planning Asha's extraction long before she was supposedly in danger. The community reaction in Boone Hollow was swift and brutal. News of Daniel's dead wife, living with his stepfather, spread through town like wildfire. People who had attended Asha's memorial service 8 years earlier now speculated about which details had been lies and which had been truth. Patricia became a subject of gossip rather than sympathy. Was she complicit in the deception, or was she another victim? Local law enforcement was initially skeptical of Daniel's claims. The case involved international fraud, identity theft, and potentially bigamy, but proving criminal activity required evidence that was scattered across multiple jurisdictions. The Kentucky State Police opened an investigation but warned Daniel that prosecuting crimes committed in foreign countries with potentially falsified documentation would be extremely difficult. Daniel's relationship with his mother deteriorated rapidly. Patricia refused to believe that Robert had deceived her. She accused Daniel of fabricating evidence because he couldn't accept Asha's death. When Daniel showed her proof of Robert's false identity, she claimed he had hired people to create fraudulent documents. When he presented photographs of Asha and Robert together, she suggested they were digitally manipulated. The psychological toll was devastating. Daniel had spent 8 years grieving a woman who wasn't dead. He had rebuilt his identity around loss that was fabricated. He had accepted comfort from a man who was actively betraying him. Every memory of the past decade was now contaminated by the knowledge that nothing had been real. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. Because Chen's investigation had uncovered evidence that Robert's involvement in Asha's life predated their marriage by several years. Phone records showed contact between Robert and numbers in India dating back to 2013, 2 years before Asha supposedly died, and 1 year before Robert married Patricia, which meant Robert hadn't found Asha after her supposed death. He had been in contact with her before she supposedly died, which meant the entire story about family debts and dangerous creditors was likely fabricated, which meant Asha's disappearance had been planned from the beginning, with Robert as the architect rather than the rescuer. The question that haunted Daniel wasn't just who Robert really was or how long he had been planning this deception. The question was why Asha had agreed to participate in destroying the life of the man she had once claimed to love, and whether Daniel would ever discover the truth about what had really happened to his marriage, his family, and his ability to trust anyone ever again. 3 years have passed since Daniel Whitmore discovered his dead wife was alive and living with his stepfather. The criminal investigation stalled due to jurisdictional complications and lack of concrete evidence. Robert and Asha disappeared from Boone Hollow 6 months after their confrontation with Daniel, leaving no forwarding address and no trace of their whereabouts. Patricia filed for divorce citing abandonment, but she never fully accepted that her husband had been living under a false identity. Daniel still lives 2 towns over from his childhood home, working engineering contracts that keep him traveling most of the year. Friends describe him as functional but fundamentally changed. He completes projects efficiently and maintains professional relationships, but he doesn't form personal attachments. He doesn't date. He doesn't attend family gatherings. He exists in a state of emotional isolation that protects him from further betrayal but also prevents him from experiencing genuine connection. The questions that drove Daniel's investigation remain unanswered, and they reveal disturbing truths about human nature and the vulnerability of trust. Was Asha always planning to leave Daniel, or did Robert manipulate her into the deception? The evidence suggests both possibilities. Phone records indicate contact between Robert and Asha before their marriage, which implies advanced planning. But Asha's behavior during their marriage seemed genuinely affectionate, which suggests she may have been coerced or gradually manipulated into participating. The truth probably lies somewhere between voluntary conspiracy and psychological coercion. Robert appears to have been a professional manipulator who identified Asha as a target and Daniel as a mark. He may have convinced Asha that leaving Daniel was necessary for her safety or that staying would put Daniel in danger. Or he may have offered her financial security and emotional stability that her marriage couldn't provide. How long was Robert planning this deception? The timeline suggests years of preparation. Creating a false identity requires extensive documentation and careful maintenance. Establishing relationships with international contacts who could stage a death in India requires significant resources and criminal connections. Moving money through offshore accounts without detection requires sophisticated knowledge of financial systems. Robert wasn't an opportunistic con artist who saw a chance and took it. He was a professional criminal who targeted the Whitmore family specifically and executed a long-term plan with military precision. Why did Robert choose Daniel's family? This question haunts Daniel more than any other. Was there something about their situation that made them attractive targets? Did Robert research their finances and determine they were worth the investment? Or was the targeting random, with Robert simply looking for a vulnerable widow who could provide him with legitimate social cover? Patricia was recently widowed when Robert appeared in her life. She was lonely, financially stable, and had an adult son with international work experience. From a criminal perspective, the Whitmore family offered multiple advantages: emotional vulnerability, financial resources, and access to international travel that could facilitate complex fraud schemes. What happened to the money? Daniel's investigation revealed that significant amounts of money had moved through accounts connected to Robert's network. Some of it came from Daniel's family, life insurance payouts, savings accounts, and property equity that Robert had access to through his marriage to Patricia. But the amounts were larger than what the Whitmores could have provided, which suggests Robert was running similar schemes with multiple families simultaneously. The money trail disappeared into cryptocurrency exchanges and international banking systems that make recovery nearly impossible. Even if Robert were arrested and convicted, the financial damage to his victims would likely be permanent. Here's what really disturbs me about this case, and why I need you to understand the importance of supporting investigative work like this. Cases like Daniel's happen more often than you think, but they don't get mainstream media attention because they're too complex and too uncomfortable. The average person doesn't want to believe that their spouse, their parents' new partner, or their trusted family friend could be a professional criminal running long-term deception schemes. But these predators exist, and they specifically target people who don't expect betrayal from family members. If this story makes you uncomfortable, good. It should. And if you want more cases like this that challenge what you think you know about trust and deception, you need to subscribe and share this channel. Because the only way these stories get told is with your support. The psychological impact on victims extends far beyond financial losses. Daniel didn't just lose money. He lost his ability to trust his own perceptions about reality. He spent 8 years grieving a person who wasn't dead. He accepted comfort from a man who was actively betraying him. He built his entire identity around a lie that multiple people maintained for nearly a decade. Recovery from this level of psychological manipulation requires reconstructing one's understanding of human nature from the ground up. It means accepting that people you love are capable of sustained deception. It means recognizing that kindness and helpfulness can be weapons rather than genuine emotions. It means learning to trust your instincts even when everyone around you is telling you those instincts are wrong. The life lesson here isn't paranoia or cynicism. It's awareness. Professional manipulators rely on their target's assumption that normal people don't engage in elaborate long-term deceptions. They exploit our tendency to accept surface-level explanations and avoid asking uncomfortable questions. They use our politeness and social conditioning against us. Daniel's story teaches us that trust should be earned gradually through consistent behavior over time, not granted immediately based on circumstances or social connections. It teaches us that when something feels wrong, further investigation is warranted, even if that investigation seems rude or suspicious. Most importantly, it teaches us that recovering from betrayal requires accepting that some questions may never be answered and some justice may never be served. Daniel will probably never know Robert's real name or his ultimate motives. He will probably never recover the money that was stolen from his family. He will probably never get the satisfaction of seeing his tormentors face consequences for their actions. But he survived. And sometimes, survival is the only victory available. The story of Daniel Whitmore forces us to confront the most unsettling questions about human relationships and the nature of trust. How well do we really know the people we share our lives with? What secrets are hidden behind familiar faces and comfortable routines? And when someone shows us kindness during our darkest moments, how do we distinguish between genuine compassion and calculated manipulation? Daniel's nightmare continues today. Somewhere in the world, Robert and Asha are living under new identities, possibly targeting new families, possibly running the same elaborate deception that destroyed Daniel's life. They face no consequences for the psychological devastation they caused. They keep whatever money they stole. They continue their relationship built on the foundation of another man's grief. But their story also reveals something crucial about human resilience. Daniel survived betrayal that would have destroyed weaker people. He rebuilt his life after discovering that his entire reality had been constructed around lies. He chose truth over comfort, even when that truth was devastating. He refused to accept easy explanations when his instincts told him something was wrong. The questions Daniel's case raises should disturb all of us. How many Roberts are out there, building false identities and infiltrating families? How many Ashas have chosen deception over honesty when faced with difficult circumstances? How many of us would recognize the warning signs before it was too late? Most importantly, how do we protect ourselves and our families without becoming so suspicious that we can't form genuine relationships? How do we maintain our capacity for trust while acknowledging that some people are professional predators who specialize in exploiting that trust? Daniel doesn't have answers to these questions. Neither do the investigators who worked his case. Neither do the psychologists who study long-term deception. But asking these questions is the first step toward protecting yourself from becoming the next victim. Thank you for watching this investigation into one of the most complex betrayal cases I've ever covered. If this story opened your eyes to possibilities you hadn't considered before, please hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications because cases like Daniel's require extensive research and international investigation that mainstream media won't touch. Drop your theories in the comments below. Do you think Asha was Robert's willing partner from the beginning? Or do you believe she was manipulated into participating? What do you think Robert's real identity is, and why did he target the Whitmore family specifically? Share your thoughts because your insights help piece together these complex cases. Until next time, remember that truth is often stranger and more disturbing than fiction, and sometimes the people who seem most trustworthy are the ones you should watch most carefully.